In the remote highlands of eastern Oregon, buried beneath more than a century of silence, lies a truth so unsettling that local officials worked to erase it from memory. Between 1852 and 1888, over 800 emigrants disappeared along a short 20-mile section of the Oregon Trail. These were not the victims of cholera, wagon accidents, or starvation. Their fate was far darker. At the center of this horror stood the Sacred Heart Chapel, weathered wooden building that promised weary pioneers salvation, but instead became the stage for one of the most calculated killing enterprises in American frontier history. What began as scattered vanishings grew into a family business, methodical, organized, and chillingly efficient. The Grayson family didn't just kill out of greed. They refined murder into a grim craft. They kept careful ledgers of the people. They lured in the families they ruined, and the shallow graves they left behind. Before we descend into the nightmare of the Graysons and their victims, I need to ask something of you. This channel is not for the faint of heart. Only those willing to confront the darkest corners of America's hidden past should continue. If you're one of them, subscribe now and drop a comment with the state you're listening from. Your support allows us to keep unearthing stories others would rather stay buried. Now, let's turn the clock back to 1852, when the Oregon Trail was both a highway of dreams and a corridor of death. Stretching over 2,000 miles, it carried countless families westward through unforgiving wilderness. Every mile was a gamble disease. Hunger and storms claimed many lives. But in the Blue Mountains of Oregon, death wore another mask, a smiling face offering Christian comfort while secretly weighing the worth of a family's belongings. The year 1852 marked the height of westward migration. Over 50,000 people pressed toward Oregon's fertile valleys. By the time wagon trains reached the Blue Mountains, most had traveled nearly 1,800 grueling miles. Exhaustion, disease, and dwindling provisions left them vulnerable. It was here, in 1851, that Father Morai Grayson founded the Sacred Heart Chapel. The small timber building stood on a hill overlooking a natural resting place along the trail, spot where travelers often paused to bury their dead and rest their animals to passing families. The chapel looked like Providence itself, a sanctuary in the wilderness. Father Morai, a gaunt man in his 40s, with piercing gray eyes and a commanding voice, presented himself as a traveling missionary. His sermons, core, convincing, his scripture, fluent enough to win the trust of even the skeptical. Beside him was his wife, who called herself Sister Constance, a soft-spoken woman whose gentle demeanor and supposed medical skills made her indispensable to the sick and dying. Completing the trio was Morai's younger brother, Ezekiel, practical, strong, and skilled with tools and livestock. Two pioneers, they appeared to be the perfect frontier family, devoted to serving strangers in God's name. The chapel was simple, yet carefully kept. Rough-hewn pews faced a wooden cross said to be carved by Morai himself. Next to the building was a small graveyard, and beneath it lay a basement unusually large for such a modest structure, explained by the Graysons as storage for food and supplies. Their isolation worked in their favor. The nearest settlement was more than 15 miles away, meaning few outsiders ever saw what truly happened within those walls. Settlers who did encounter them spoke highly of the family, praising their charity and piety, and on the surface it was believable. Who else would dedicate their lives to ministering to sick and dying strangers in the middle of nowhere? What made the Graysons especially effective was their grasp of the hardships of the trail. They knew that families arriving in their stretch were desperate sick children, starving oxen, and broken wagons. The Graysons positioned themselves as both healers and helpers, food, repairs, and shelter, all while adjusting their religious language to match the denomination of whoever stood before them. The first disappearance tied to them occurred on September 23, 1852. Decades would pass before investigators pieced it together. But the Morrison family, James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 children, and Elizabeth's elderly father were among the earliest victims. They had broken from their wagon train after entering Oregon territory, convinced they could finish the journey alone, when their wagon axle snapped just 2 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel. They believed it was a stroke of luck. In truth, it was the beginning of their end. James Morrison would later recall in territorial records that the chapel had seemed like a divine blessing when he first spotted it from the ridge where his wagon had broken down. Before long, Brother Ezekiel appeared, just as he always seemed to do whenever weary travelers were in need, speaking in the slow, deliberate tone that became his signature. He said, "Brother, the Lord has led you to our chapel for a reason. Sister Constance has helped many women bring children safely into the world, and your Elizabeth looks near her time. Father Marai would be honored if you accepted our shelter while you mend your wagon and prepare for the birth." Grateful and relieved, the Morrison family accepted. They settled into a small cabin next to the chapel, kept ready for guests by the Graysons themselves. For 3 days, life seemed peaceful and ordinary. Elizabeth was lovingly cared for by Sister Constance. James worked with Ezekiel on wagon repairs, and Father Murray offered spiritual reassurance. The children played freely in the yard, and Elizabeth's aging father, Samuel, rested in a rocking chair on the porch dot. But on the 4th day, things began to unravel. Samuel was the first to fall ill, suffering from severe stomach pains and sickness. Sister Constance diagnosed it as the common trail sickness and began treating him with her called Holy Remedies herbal mixtures she prepared in the basement of the chapel. "The Lord provides through nature," she would say gently, "but sometimes the body must purge itself of its poisons before healing can begin." Yet instead of improving, Samuel's condition worsened. His skin grew ashen, his breathing shallow, and violent fits of vomiting and diarrhea soon followed. James, worried for his father-in-law, suggested seeking help from the nearby trading post. But Father Marai dissuaded him, speaking with quiet conviction. "Brother James, I have seen this ailment many times upon the trail. To move him now would be certain death. We must trust God's timing and Sister Constance's gifts of healing. By the 6th day, young Tommy, age 7, grew ill. Soon after, his 5-year-old sister Mary followed. Constance worked tirelessly at their bedsides, preparing more of her remedies, watching over the children through the night. To James and Elizabeth, still healthy though exhausted, she seemed like a saint, sacrificing herself for their family's welfare. But the reality was far darker. The blessed remedies contained carefully measured amounts of arsenic, acquired under the guise of pest control from nearby mining camps. The symptoms: stomach cramps, nausea, gray skin, and eventual organ failure mimicked common frontier illnesses so convincingly that no grieving parent would think to question them. On the 7th day, Samuel passed away. Tommy followed 2 days later, and Mary on the 11th. Each death was accompanied by solemn rituals led by Father Morai, who spoke movingly about their souls entering heaven and the peace of God's embrace. The devastated family, clinging to their faith, never suspected foul play. After all, entire households were known to die of disease on the trail. But while they prayed, Brother Ezekiel combed through their belongings each night, making note of valuables. The Morrisons had been prosperous in Missouri, and their wagon carried fine goods furniture, tools, heirlooms, and gold James had sewn into his clothing. On the 12th day, James himself began to show the same symptoms. Elizabeth, heavily pregnant, and terrified of losing her husband, pleaded with Sister Constance to save him. Constance's reply was chilling. "My dear child, some illnesses are simply God's call to bring his children home. Your husband will be reunited with your precious little ones in paradise. You will raise your new baby knowing your family waits for you in glory." James died 2 days later, just hours before Elizabeth gave birth to a son. The infant lived only long enough to be baptized by Father Morai. Within 3 days, Elizabeth also succumbed, leaving the entire Morrison family gone in less than 3 weeks. To outsiders, the Graysons' explanation was perfectly reasonable. The family had arrived already weary and sick, had contracted a virulent form of dysentery, and died despite the Graysons' tireless Christian care. Father Morai buried them with proper rites in the chapel cemetery, while their possessions were consecrated to the Lord's work, a pious phrase, disguising theft. But the Morrison tragedy was only the beginning. In it, the Graysons discovered a dark truth, that murder, when disguised with planning, patience, and religious authority, could be both undetectable and immensely profitable. They learned that isolated families were the easiest prey, that slow arsenic poisoning mirrored natural illnesses, and that their roles as healers and ministers gave them unquestioned credibility. These lessons would shape a campaign of terror that haunted the Oregon Trail for the next 36 years. The Graysons soon realized the Oregon Trail offered them an inexhaustible stream of victims who could vanish without raising suspicion for months if anyone noticed at all. In settled towns, disappearances were quickly remarked upon, but the trail was different. Families were scattered, constantly moving, and their whereabouts uncertain to relatives back east. A family that disappeared in Oregon might not be expected to send word home for half a year or longer, and even then, silence could be explained away by disease, accidents, or the countless hazards of frontier life. After the Morrison killings, the Graysons refined their methods with almost businesslike precision. Each member of the family took on a specialized role. Brother Ezekiel became the lookout, riding along the trail to select likely target travelers burdened with wealth, small parties with no protection, or families already weakened by illness or broken wagons. Sister Constance perfected her use of poison, experimenting with doses and delivery so that death came quietly and suspicions were deflected. Arsenic became her weapon of choice, easy to slip into teas, tonics, and even communion wine. Father Murray, meanwhile, polished his craft of persuasion. He learned how to tailor his sermons to the faith of each family, preaching, healing, and prayer to Methodists, destiny and God's plan to Presbyterians, or the hope of salvation to Baptists. In this way, he kept his victims docile, even as sickness consumed their loved ones. The chapel itself was slowly transformed into the center of their operations. Beneath it, the basement was enlarged and divided one chamber for hoarding valuables, another for preparing poisons, and a third that served as a temporary morgue. In the grove behind the church, they dug a line of shallow, unmarked graves, a burial ground that over time would swallow hundreds of the missing. The winter of 185 to 1853 gave the Graysons time to perfect their craft. With the trail quiet, sorted through the Morrison family's belongings, deciding what could be sold, hidden, or kept. They also forged their first connections with black market traders in Oregon settlements. Brother Ezekiel excelled in this role. His open manner and believable stories convinced buyers that he was selling on behalf of families who had either returned east or perished of natural causes. To avoid suspicion, he spread out his sales across different towns, tailoring each category of goods to a particular market. Furniture and household items were taken by wealthy settlers. Farm tools went to working families, while jewelry and precious metals ended up with merchants who specialized in such trade. By the spring of 1853, the Graysons were no longer amateurs but practiced predators. They had solved every major problem of their enterprise, selecting targets, carrying out murders, disposing of bodies, and converting possessions into profit. More importantly, they had cultivated a public identity that shielded them from suspicion. Their next major success came in May of that year, with the Hoffman family, German immigrants traveling with a wagon full of valuables. Their possessions included fine tools for clockmaking, quality textiles, and a hoard of gold coins, the savings of a lifetime. They were vulnerable in every sense. Their English was poor, their customs unfamiliar, and their dependence on the Graysons' translation and guidance left them isolated from other travelers. Heinrich Hoffman, a skilled craftsman, intended to open a business in Oregon, while his wife, Greto, pregnant with their fourth child, cared for 3 children between 6 and 12. When their wagon broke down near the Sacred Heart Chapel, the Graysons seized the opportunity. This time, Sister Constance did not wait for illness to set in. She began administering poison in small doses immediately, presenting it as a medicine to ward off disease. "God will bless you for helping us," Heinrich said in his broken English. To which Constance replied, with her practiced smile, "He already has by allowing us to serve his children." The Hoffman deaths stretched over nearly a month. That slow unraveling gave the Graysons ample time to catalogue their possessions and plan how to sell the clockmaking tools and goods. It also allowed them to study the family's behavioral lessons they would use to improve future operations. By the end of 1853, 3 families, a total of 16 souls, had been erased by their hands. The Graysons now viewed their killings not as desperate acts, but as a well-run enterprise. They began keeping records lists of belongings, notes on methods, even reflections on mistakes to sharpen their craft. In their minds, they had become pioneers of a darker frontier, professional murderers hidden behind the mask of piety. The discovery of hidden records beneath the chapel decades later exposed the horrifying order behind the Grayson family's crimes. In secret compartments beneath the floorboards, investigators uncovered ledgers written in Father Marai's exacting script. Page after page detailed the fate of every family that had crossed their path. Names, dates, possessions stripped from the dead, methods of disposal, and the profits they had reaped from reselling stolen goods. Human lives were reduced to ledger lines, recorded with the detachment of an accountant balancing figures. One chilling entry read, "Morrison family, 5 departed souls, September-October 1852. Effects included 2 gold coins, household furniture, tools of fine quality. Burials carried out in Grove Section C. Profit, $400. Method, arsenic in medicinal teas. Duration, 17 days. Adjusted dosage for longer timeline to avoid suspicion." Barr's word of the Graysons' charitable work spread along the Oregon Trail. Weary families began seeking out the chapel voluntarily, walking straight into the snare so carefully laid for them. By their 2nd year, the Graysons had refined their system into something far beyond opportunistic killing. Under Father Marai's leadership, the enterprise was managed like a grim business one that happened to deal in death. The summer of 1854 marked a turning point with the arrival of the Wetherb family from Tennessee. Charles Wetherb, once a Confederate officer, had chosen to abandon his ruined plantation and chase fortune in Oregon. He traveled with his wife, Margaret, their 15-year-old twin daughters, Sarah and Susan, and Margaret's younger brother, David, a blacksmith carrying his complete set of professional tools. Unlike most of their victims, the Wetherbs were not only wealthy, but also sharp-minded and cautious. Charles had converted much of his remaining fortune into gold and jewels, hidden within a false compartment of their wagon. His military training had made him alert to danger, and Margaret Weldred, in accounts of the trail, was wary of trusting strangers. When their wagon wheel gave way near the chapel, Charles hesitated to accept the Graysons' aid. Stories of vanished travelers lingered in his mind, and the sudden appearance of Brother Ezekiel struck him as suspiciously convenient. "I appreciate your Christian kindness," he told Father Murray, "but we've the tools and skills to manage on our own. We'll be moving on shortly." Morai, however, was a master reader of people. Rather than pressing, he stepped back with apparent grace. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Sister Constance had seen signs of sickness, possibly cholera or dysentery among recent travelers. "Of course," Brother Charles Marai said with calm understanding. "A wise man guards his family. Still, I would be neglecting my duty if I didn't warn you. Trail fever can lie quiet before it strikes, and moving on too soon risks both your kin and others along the road." The seed of doubt was planted. Margaret, weary from the road and fearful for her daughter's health, began to waver. When young David developed a mild fever, the next day a symptom Sister Constance quickly labeled as an early stage of the regional illness. Their resistance collapsed. Margaret pleaded with her husband to remain at the chapel until David recovered. Charles relented, though uneasily. Unlike past victims, however, he remained on edge. He studied every move the Graysons made, asking pointed questions about their background and the fate of previous families. The Graysons adapted smoothly, producing polished lies, stories of successful recoveries, a cemetery of supposed trail dead, even forged testimonial letters from grateful travelers who had survived under their care. One evening, as Charles and Marai sat on the chapel porch, the preacher turned his caution into a weapon. "Brother Charles," Marai said, "I respect a soldier's vigilance, but think, had we meant you harm, would we not have acted long ago? Why would we risk confronting a trained man with weapons, when so many easier prey pass this way?" The logic was disarming. By acknowledging Charles's suspicion, Murray made him feel respected. By pointing out his own strength, he made danger seem improbable. The Wethers' destruction unfolded more slowly than any before. It took nearly 6 weeks for the Graysons to finish the man-endurance test of patience and calculation. Sister Constance began with minuscule doses of arsenic, slipped into blessed water she prescribed as a safeguard against disease. The symptoms came gradually, indistinguishable from natural illness. David, the youngest and frailest, was the first to perish. His death seemed to validate Constance's warnings, and the family's grief only deepened their reliance on her care. Margaret was the next to fall ill, her decline explained by Sister Constance as the natural result of tending tirelessly to David. Yet Charles, ever the soldier trained to recognize patterns on the battlefield, began piecing together a disturbing picture. He noticed that while he and his daughters remained healthy, the others weakened in succession. The symptoms were strange, and always the Graysons seemed to be close at hand during the worst moments. His unease sharpened when he caught Brother Ezekiel rifling through the family's wagon late at night. Startled, Ezekiel claimed he was only ensuring their provisions were safe from animals. The excuse sounded reasonable, but Charles's instincts screamed otherwise. The following morning, with his wife pale and fading, he whispered to her, "Margaret, we have to leave this place. Something is wrong here." But she was far too weak to move, and attempting to travel would have killed her. Charles found himself torn between duty to his family and the gnawing certainty that remaining meant death. The truth revealed itself soon after. While searching the chapel's cellar for medicine, Charles stumbled upon a hidden compartment. Inside lay belongings no traveler would willingly abandon treasured items too personal to be discarded. A small doll, worn but clearly cherished by a child. A pocket watch engraved with a stranger's name. Most damning, a letter addressed to Oregon City, written only weeks before, thanking God for the kindness of the Christian family who had taken them in. The letter had never been sent. Charles knew then, beyond doubt, these people had been murdered, and his own family was meeting the same fate. But his realization came too late. That night Margaret died, and by dawn Charles himself felt the same creeping sickness. What he could not know was that the Graysons had marked him as a threat. Father Morai had poisoned his evening meal with a lethal dose of arsenic, ensuring the soldier would not live long enough to resist. As Charles lay dying, his twin daughters nearby, he tried desperately to warn them of the danger. But his words, slurred with fever and poison, were dismissed as delirium. The children still trusted the very people destroying them. The web tragedy proved a turning point for the Graysons. They learned that suspicious victims required subtler manipulation. They discovered that stretching the killings over days, though riskier, created a far more convincing illusion of illness. They perfected ways to silence suspicion before it spread. Above all, they realized that even clever, cautious people could be deceived with the right mixture of patience, performance, and faith-laced persuasion. This emboldened them to target wealthier, more prominent families, secure in the belief their methods could outwit anyone. From that point on, they became more meticulous. Evidence that could reveal their crimes was burned. Jewelry was melted down. Possessions worth keeping were hidden in secret caches. By the end of 1854, 23 souls from 7 families had perished at their hands. The Graysons no longer saw themselves as murderers, but as chosen instruments of God, rewarded with prosperity taken from the dead. The year 1855 brought their first true crisis. It began, as always, with an unsuspecting family, the Pattersons, prosperous merchants from Ohio bound for Oregon. Thomas Patterson had sold his business, traveling west with his wife Emily, their 4 children, and Emily's sister Catherine. Begg carried not only wealth in gold and banknotes, but also a respectability that meant their disappearance would be noticed. Brother Ezekiel spotted their wagon about 5 miles from the chapel. Unlike many of his victims, they were neither stranded nor ill, but Ezekiel had grown skilled at manufacturing opportunity. Approaching with a wide smile, he called out, "Fine oxen you've got there, friend. Chapel's just ahead, and we've fresh supplies if you'd care to trade." Thomas Patterson, cautious by nature, sensed something rehearsed in Ezekiel's friendliness. He listened politely, but withheld his decision. For the first time, the Graysons were about to discover what happened when their carefully honed methods failed to completely ensnare their prey. Thomas answered politely but firmly, "We thank you for your concern, but our wagons are stocked well enough to see us through. We'll be pressing on at first light." Brother Ezekiel had clearly anticipated such resistance. "Naturally, of course," he replied with an easy smile. "But there's something you may wish to consider before moving on. Sister Constanza Healer has been treating a troubling fever that's been circulating in these hills. Creeps in slow and quiet, so that by the time families notice, they're too feeble to travel. She has preventative remedies that have spared many a household." The word fever instantly caught Emily Patterson's ear. Her children's safety was never far from her thoughts, and the suggestion of an unseen illness terrified her. "Fever? We've heard no word of sickness in these parts," she said anxiously. "Well, ma'am," Ezekiel said with sympathetic gravity, "no one likes to spread such news. Worries the travelers and hurts trade. But Sister Constance's remedies, when taken early, make all the difference. It might ease your mind to let her examine your family, just as a precaution." Thomas was doubtful, but Emily pressed him quietly. "If there truly is disease about, should we not at least hear what this woman has to say, for the children's sake?" Reluctantly, he agreed to stop at the chapel, convincing himself they would simply gather information and leave. He could not have known this choice would draw his family into the darkest ordeal of their lives. The Graysons welcomed the Pattersons with their familiar blend of warmth and quiet persuasion. Father Murray spoke knowledgeably of trade and conditions. Be in Oregon, earning Thomas's respect. Sister Constance's gentle manner and fondness for children quickly won Emily's trust. Ezekiel amused the youngsters with stories of frontier hardships and handy demonstrations of his skills. Within hours, the family felt obliged to stay the night so Sister Constance could carry out her examinations. As expected, her findings were troubling. Several family members, supposedly, showed the faint beginnings of mountain fever and required immediate treatment. Catherine Patterson Millie's unmarried sister, who had long dedicated herself to helping raise the children, was the first to accept the concoction. Protective by nature, she urged the others to follow her example. But Catherine was also the sharpest observer in the group. She began noticing small, unsettling details. On the second night, she saw Ezekiel making what looked like an inventory of their wagon's contents. When she questioned it, Sister Constance explained smoothly that they always catalogued guest possessions to prevent theft. Reasonable enough, but Catherine's unease only deepened. Other signs followed. Father Murray's lingering interest in Thomas's gold watch, Constance's habit of preparing all medicines in strict privacy, the strange coincidence that those who swallowed her doses seemed to worsen rather than improve. The turning point came when Catherine caught Sister Constance mixing a fine white powder into a draught meant for young Timothy. When asked, Constance claimed it was blessed salt to strengthen the herbs. But Catherine, daughter of a pharmacist, knew better. This was no ordinary salt, and Constance's sudden defensiveness confirmed her suspicions. That night, Catherine resolved to act. She began discarding her own medicine in secret, pretending to drink while spitting it into a cloth. She also convinced little Timothy to do the same, turning it into a playful game. The results were striking. While Thomas, Emily, and the older children grew steadily weaker, Catherine and Timothy remained strong. By the 6th day, tragedy had already struck. 2 of the children were dead. Thomas lay near death, and Emily was failing fast. Desperate, Catherine confided her suspicions to her sister. "Emily," she whispered, "these people aren't curing us. They're poisoning us." At first, Emily recoiled in disbelief. It seemed unthinkable that their pious hosts could harbor murderous intent. But as Catherine laid out the evidence, the patterns, the secrecy, the worsening symptoms, Emily's resistance gave way to dread. "What can we do?" she whispered. "Thomas is dying. The children are dying, and we have no strength left," Catherine answered with grim determination. "If we remain here, we'll all perish. We must flee tonight, and Timothy must come with us. He's the only one left untouched." So, in the darkest hours before dawn, Catherine put her plan into motion. With painstaking care, she helped the weakened Emily and little Timothy slip away from the chapel. It was a desperate gamble, but their only chance at survival. Thomas was too weak to rise, and the older children had already slipped into unconsciousness. But Catherine made the heartbreaking choice to leave them rather than risk the lives of those she might still save. With trembling hands, she guided the few survivors to the wagon where she had hidden a portion of their gold and some supplies. As they were preparing to depart, the sound of approaching footsteps froze her blood. Someone was coming from the chapel. It was Father Murray. Drawn by some faint noise, he emerged into the night. "Quick," Catherine whispered, her voice sharp with fear. "Into the wagon bed beneath the canvas. Stay silent no matter what happens." When Murray found Catherine standing by the wagon, his expression confirmed her darkest suspicions. Instead of concern for a sick woman wandering in confusion, his face was calculating and cold. "Sister Catherine," he murmured, his voice smooth and low, "you ought to be resting. The mountain fever can cloud judgment." "I couldn't sleep," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was worried for Thomas and the children." Morai studied her in silence, as though weighing whether she had uncovered his secret. The moment stretched taut, each waiting for the other to slip. "Perhaps," Morai said at last, "Sister Constance should prepare something stronger for use something to help you rest peacefully." Catherine understood instantly. He meant to kill her outright, rather than wait for the poison to finish its work. "That's kind of you," she said carefully, "but I'll try natural sleep first." "I'm afraid I must insist," Mare replied. His hand slid toward something hidden beneath his coat. What followed would scar Catherine Patterson's memory forever. As Mare stepped closer, clearly intent on forcing her back inside, Emily Patterson appeared from the shadows of the wagon. Despite her weakness from the poison, she had managed to take up Thomas's pistol. "Step away from my sister," Emily said, her voice frail but steady. Marai turned toward her, distracted for just a second. Catherine seized the chance, snatching a heavy iron tool from the wagon and striking him across the head. The blow wasn't fatal, but it dazed him long enough for the two women and the child to scramble into the wagon. They pulled away just as Brother Ezekiel rushed out of the chapel. Drawn by the commotion, Catherine's final glimpse of him was as he ran toward the cabin, where the rest of her family lay dying, likely to ensure their deaths were complete. The escape was a nightmare of exhaustion and terror. Emily, nearly undone by weeks of slow poisoning, drifted in and out of consciousness. That left Catherine to guide the wagon, watch the road, tend Timothy, and keep constant watch for pursuit. They had no real destination, only the desperate need to find help before the Graysons caught them or Emily succumbed. For 3 days they wandered through unknown country, following rough hunting paths and praying to meet other travelers. Timothy, traumatized by the horror, hardly spoke a word. Emily's fevered mind often cried out for her dead children and husband. On the 4th day, deliverance came in the form of a military patrol from Fort Dales. The soldiers, searching the area for signs of Indian movement, at first doubted Catherine's story. It sounded too fantastic, too deranged. But Catherine had proof. A vial of Sister Constance's so-called medicine. Traces of the white powder she had seen added to the doses, and several items Ezekiel had handled with too much interest. Most of all, she had Emily, though barely coherent. Emily's symptoms matched those of arsenic poisoning. The military's investigation soon revealed the horrifying truth. When troops reached the chapel, they discovered Thomas Patterson and his 3 elder children dead, their bodies unmistakably poisoned. The Graysons themselves had vanished, carrying with them much of the loot hidden in the chapel's cellar. It was in those secret compartments that investigators uncovered the scope of the horror possessions from dozens of families, neatly stored and sorted. Most damning of all were Father Marai's ledgers, meticulous records of each family lured, murdered, and robbed. The entries revealed that the Pattersons were intended to be victim number 37 in less than 3 years. Over 150 men, women, and children had been slaughtered. The ledgers described profits gained, methods used, and lessons learned, as though the killings were nothing more than business transactions. Catherine Patterson's survival, testimony, and evidence marked the beginning of the end for the Grayson family. Yet it would take years for authorities to comprehend the true scale of their crimes and to hunt the fugitives. In the meantime, word of the chapel's dark secrets spread like wildfire, leaving wagon trains and trail communities forever wary of strangers offering charity. The 3 survivors paid a steep price. Emily never recovered. Her body, too damaged by the arsenic, gave out within a year. Timothy grew to manhood scarred by nightmares, unable ever again to trust clergy. Catherine herself became consumed by the need to see the Graysons brought to justice. She gave testimony again and again to soldiers, territorial courts, and federal marshals her survival, ensuring the killers could one day be held to account. Her recollections and the ledgers she described became the foundation of everything investigators later uncovered. But while Catherine told her story, the Graysons were already at large, continuing their work in the shadows, undeterred and still hungry for victims. Years of practice in covering their tracks, combined with the wealth they had amassed from countless victims, allowed the Grayson family to anticipate discovery and prepare backup plans for continuing their crimes elsewhere. By the fall of 1855, a full-scale manhunt was launched, yet the Graysons had advantages few fugitives could match. They knew the hidden trails and wilderness of the Oregon Territory carried significant financial reserves, and, most dangerously, could reinvent themselves under entirely new identities. Wherever they settled, they posed as respectable strangers, their bloody past erased. The investigation fell to Federal Marshal William Riss, who quickly realized this was unlike any case he had faced. The Graysons weren't outlaws fleeing after a single desperate crime. They were a well-organized family of killers who had thrived for years by exploiting the faith and desperation of their victims. Their religious disguise was so convincing that many who had met them refused to accept they could be guilty of murder. In his report, Riss wrote, "These are not men driven by rage or impulse. They are deliberate predators who have transformed murder into a calculated trade. They wield faith as a weapon and possess both the money and cunning to vanish and begin anew whenever needed." The first real lead came in the spring of 1857, when authorities in California noted troubling reports about a newly established mission along the Oregon-California border, calling itself the Mission of Divine Mercy. It had appeared suddenly in a strategic spot intersecting multiple wagon routes. Travelers who stopped there were vanishing under mysterious circumstances. The mission was run by a supposed priest, Father Benedict Morrison, aided by Sister Mary Morrison and Brother Thomas Morrison. To outsiders, they seemed a pious family, devoted to charity. But Marshal Riss recognized the pattern instantly. Catherine Patterson's testimony and the evidence uncovered at the Sacred Heart Chapel made it clear these were the Graysons in disguise. The mission's location was deliberately chosen to intercept small, wealthy wagon parties' families, isolated on the trail, worn down and vulnerable. The compound itself was larger and better equipped than their former chapel, with cellars, bowed buildings, and spaces clearly designed to support large-scale murder and concealment. Reports of missing families from the area matched the Graysons' preferred targets: prosperous settlers traveling alone, determined not to repeat past mistakes. Riss assembled federal agents and military troops. This time, the approach would be calculated, patient, and thorough. His men watched from the surrounding hills for weeks, confirming their fears. The Graysons had not only resumed their crimes, but refined their methods. During surveillance, the Hendersons, a prosperous family from Missouri, traveling with 4 children, arrived at the mission. Their wagon, heavy with goods and money, made them ideal prey. The Graysons fell into their old routine with chilling precision. Father Marine, now Father Benedict, greeted them warmly while sizing up their resources. Sister Constance, under the name Sister Mary, singled out those she might lure into medical care. Brother Ezekiel, now Brother Thomas, carefully examined their belongings. But there were new, darker developments. The Graysons had recruited local accomplices, posing as traders and scouts, who acted as lookouts and aided in killings. They had also devised better methods of body disposal and concealment. Even more disturbing, the surveillance team witnessed the family experimenting with faster ways to eliminate victims. Instead of slowly poisoning over weeks with arsenic, they began using more immediate poisons capable of wiping out families in days. They had learned that speed meant less risk of exposure. Chris's agents soon faced a terrible choice. Step in now to save the Hendersons, or wait for ironclad evidence at the cost of more innocent lives. The decision was forced when an agent saw Ezekiel give the Hendersons' youngest child a drink of milk laced with poison. Within hours, the boy fell violently ill. "We move now," Rhys ordered. "No more families die while we stand by." At dawn on June 15th, 1857, almost 2 years after the Graysons' escape from the Sacred Heart, Chapel Federal troops stormed the mission of Divine Mercy. Surrounding the compound before sunrise ensured there would be no chance for escape or destruction of evidence. What they uncovered inside exceeded even their worst fears. The cellars beneath the chapel contained belongings from no fewer than 20 families, far more than the Graysons could have acquired during their short residence at that site. Concealed compartments revealed ledgers that chronicled murders committed not only in Oregon and California, but in several other territories where the family had previously operated. Investigators came to realize that this was not the work of opportunistic killers, but a long-standing criminal network. The Graysons had been preying upon travelers since at least 1845, moving from one region to the next as circumstances demanded, leaving behind a trail of death that spanned over a decade. Among the evidence were Father Marai's personal journals, which exposed the psychological descent of the group's leader. His earliest writings suggested he struggled with guilt, cloaking his actions in religious justification, convincing himself that he was sparing suffering pioneers while carrying out God's will. But as the years passed, any trace of moral conflict disappeared. Later entries treated murder as nothing more than business, evaluating methods for efficiency and profit. Victims were reduced to mere entries in an account book, and their deaths described as part of a carefully managed operation. Even more unsettling were Marai's plans for the future. He detailed schemes to expand their reach, envisioning separate murder sites run by different family members along popular travel routes. His notes also revealed experiments in methods that could kill larger groups at once. Driven by frustration with the inefficiency of dispatching families individually, the Henderson family narrowly escaped becoming one of these statistics. Discovered while still in the early stages of poisoning, they survived and provided crucial testimony. James Henderson, the patriarch, described how thoroughly they had been deceived. They seemed like angels from heaven, Sister Mary was gentle with the children. Father Benedict spoke with the voice of Scripture. If someone had told me they were murderers, I'd have thought them mad. His account revealed how the Graysons' combination of religious authority, medical knowledge, and apparent charity could disarm even cautious, educated travelers who had been warned about trusting strangers. When Sister Constance was interrogated, she displayed no remorse. Instead, she insisted their victims were better off dead, claiming those people were dying anyway. We gave them peace and used their possessions for God's work. Brother Ezekiel remained silent, seemingly content to portray himself as an unquestioning follower. Father Murray, however, dropped his mask entirely when confronted with the evidence. Gone was the charismatic preacher. In his place stood a cold, pragmatic killer. "You don't understand," he told investigators. "We removed the weak and diseased. We redistributed resources to those who could use them. We were agents of divine will and natural law." As investigators traced the family's records against reports of disappearances, a chilling picture emerged. Scattered graves along the trail, families who vanished without explanation, and mysterious outbreaks at remote religious sites all pointed back to the Grayson. By the end of the inquiry, authorities tied them to more than 800 murders across multiple states and territories, though the true number was likely higher. The family's trial began in September 1857, quickly becoming one of the most infamous proceedings in frontier history. Prosecutors faced a difficult task, presenting evidence from crimes long concealed and victims who could no longer speak. Their strongest weapon was Murray's own meticulous record-keeping. His journals, written in his own hand and containing details only the killers could know, became undeniable confessions. Equally vital was the testimony of Catherine Patterson, a survivor who shed light on the Graysons' methods. Her story revealed not only the careful system behind the murders, but also the psychological control the family exerted over their victims. Together, the records and eyewitness accounts built a case that finally unmasked the full scope of the Grayson family's reign of terror. The testimony of the Henderson family revealed that the Graysons did not stop their violent schemes after escaping the Sacred Heart Chapel. Instead, they grew bolder and more methodical. Their attempted murders at the Mission of Divine Mercy showed a frightening evolution in their tactics, no longer relying on slow deceit, but using faster, deadlier methods to wipe out entire families in a single stroke. The prosecution's case was strengthened by more than survivor accounts. At both crime sites, investigators uncovered damning physical evidence: stolen belongings from numerous trail families, instruments and supplies for mixing poison, maps marking hidden grave sites, and even letters connecting the Graysons to underground dealers who trafficked in stolen goods. The defense argued desperately that the family had only been offering medical treatment to sick travelers, claiming the many deaths were the result of natural trail diseases. They even suggested that the possessions found on site were either purchased fairly or gifted by patients who hadn't survived. But these claims collapsed under scrutiny. Experts testified that the symptoms matched arsenic poisoning, not frontier illnesses. Statistical analysis proved that the number of deaths linked to the Graysons' missions could not be explained by chance. And worst of all, the family's own journals plainly described what they were doing: murder for profit, dressed up as charity. The trial lasted 6 weeks and was followed across the nation in newspaper headlines. It shocked the country that a family posing as devout missionaries had built an enterprise around the systematic slaughter of westward migrants. Father Morai Grayson was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to hang. Sister Constance received life in prison, rare and severe punishment for a woman at that time, while Brother Ezekiel was given 20 years for aiding the crimes. Their downfall marked the end of one of the darkest criminal conspiracies in the frontier era. Yet the consequences of their deeds rippled far beyond their own punishment. Travelers became more suspicious of helpful strangers along the trails. The military increased patrols. Missionaries and church groups found themselves viewed with mistrust, forced to prove their sincerity in a world where faith had been weaponized by killers. The case also exposed how weak law enforcement was across the territories. For more than a decade, the Graysons thrived because officials in different regions had no real system for sharing information about missing families or suspicious deaths. Their capture ultimately spurred new networks for communication and record-keeping. Across the West, Catherine Patterson, one of the key survivors, carried the scars of her ordeal for the rest of her life. She became a fierce advocate for better protections on the trails and worked closely with lawmen to root out suspicious activity. Her young nephew Timothy, who had barely survived, never fully recovered from the trauma, living out his days as a solitary frontier guide, determined to prevent others from walking blindly into danger. Both of the Grayson compounds were destroyed, one burned down, the other dismantled, yet the memory of their crimes haunted generations. Parents told their children cautionary stories about the false missionaries who preyed on the weak, turning these horrors into grim folk tales. The case challenged deep beliefs about morality, religion, and human nature. The Graysons weren't outwardly mad or monstrous. They were intelligent, persuasive, and utterly convincing as pillars of Christian charity. Their ability to wear a mask of goodness while orchestrating calculated murders revealed that evil could be rational, organized, and chillingly ordinary. Even worse, the family seemed to truly believe in their twisted justification that they were purging the weak and redistributing resources to the worthy. In the end, historians estimate that as many as 800 people died at their hands. Their crimes serve as a stark reminder that the frontier was not only a land of courage and opportunity, but also a hunting ground for predators who exploited trust, faith, and desperation. Today, more than 150 years later, their story still unsettles us. It reminds us that some of history's darkest figures were not bandits or warlords, but seemingly respectable people hiding behind the mask of righteousness. And while their victims lost everything, The courage of survivors like Catherine Patterson ensured that the truth was revealed, justice was served, and future families were spared. So the next time you hear romantic tales of pioneers pushing westward, remember this: survival wasn't just about braving storms, wild animals, or harsh terrain. It was also about surviving the Graysons' predators, who turned faith into a weapon and murder into a family business.